Welcome to the Caffeine Stream on Caffeine and Philosophy.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Caffeine Stream. My name is CB Robertson. This is episode 52, and I'm joined by Dylan Bain to talk about systems. Now, Dylan, you've been working in the domain of systems for some time at a level that most people are not even remotely like familiar isn't the right term. You seem to be like swimming in systems in your day-to-day work, whereas most of the rest of us are just sort of observing them from the outside. But can you tell us briefly what you do and your background in these kinds of like academically or personally in these kinds of in this kind of thinking?
Yeah. So if I were to hand you my resume, the very first thing you'd notice is that I have a plethora of experiences that are extremely eclectic. Like, for example, my undergraduate degrees, I was a double major. I double majored in computer science and history, and then I had a minor in mathematics. And then from there, I went into working in the mortgage industry, which then obviously by 2008 didn't work out. Went back to school, did a master's degree in educational policy. So looking at the educational system and how things fit together, where the funding sources and what are the different components and levers you can pull that will affect student achievement in the classroom, both on a classroom level, a school level, and then of course a district level. And as part of that, I did it. My thesis was written mostly like I did two, because there's some politics involved here. But I did a statistical analysis of test scores and looking at like how test scores are trending, whether you like George W. Bush or not. No Child Left Behind left us with a gigantic pile of numbers, and education people are typically English teachers who don't understand math. So I do, and I modeled it. And then that drove into doing a study on language and how language choice, word choice interfaces with students. From there, I went and I lived in Taiwan for a few years and taught there. And then I came back to the United States so my wife could go to graduate school, and I got real sick of low teacher pay. So I went back to school, got my master's in business administration and my CPA. And then I went to work for capital markets. I worked in the big four accounting world as an auditor. And when people say auditor, they think of the IRS, the big scary thing. I'm not that. I'm a corporate auditor. I do a lot of operational audits and consulting on that. So basically, companies pay me to come in and look at how their system is operating and how we can make it more efficient. How can we work with it? And that's a 360-degree viewpoint. So like the tools of auditing, some people are like, oh, it's just check the box, get the cookie. It's not. It's an opportunity to take apart this entity from the inside out and see how all the because when you're an auditor, you got a blank check to the whole business. I could just ask for the CEO's emails and they'll give them to me. Wow. I get to sit in the room with the C-suite and have the conversations about layoffs and political risk and supply chain issues. And COVID was just it was like a never-ending three-ring circus of interesting things to look at. And so, from there, leaving the consulting world and then going and being, an internal auditor for a company, I went into infrastructure, specifically power utilities. And if you are ever looking for a system that is just absolutely fascinating and unstable from a political formation standpoint, power utilities are your jam, man. Like, people think they're boring. They are not.
I do believe it.
That's the TLDR on me.
Okay. Well, the internal corporate auditing seems like a fascinating thing. And the question that immediately jumps to my mind is, what's the framework for auditing? Do you come into a situation like that with the by beginning by saying, okay, what's the goal of this company and how do we improve the pursuit of that goal? Or is the goal assumed to be financial bottom line from the get-go and move from there?
Great question. And the answer is it depends.
Okay.
I'm giving you the
That's a good
stock
answer.
CPA. Yeah, I'm giving you the stop CPA answer. It depends. So there's always this question of when you're, it depends on what type of audit you're doing. But if let's just say it's an operational audit, so we're looking at how the company functions. If I come in and I say, all right, we're going to be looking at this particular process of this part of the company, the first question you got to ask is, okay, what is the purpose of this process? Like, why do we have it? What's the end result supposed to be? How does it interact with the rest of it? Once you have that, the next question you have to ask is, why do we have it really? Because the first answer is going to be the textbook answer that fits with the mission statement.
Right.
But the second one's going to be, why are they actually spending the money? And that's typically, they don't want to say that out loud. And so you're either inferring it or you really got to be real skillful in getting it out of somebody.
Yeah. And I mean, and this is where the systems of management within a business can dictate language. Like, and on a construction site where I'm at, the superstructure of systems above any individual company decree that more or less any statement made that revolves around the subject of safety is sacred and unchallengeable, because of the insurance incentives in place on matters of safety. On other things, we have a little more flexibility. And so I imagine a lot of the textbook answers offered there come from like, well, HR permits or looks more favorably upon this or that kind of language. But I mean, I follow, going back a little bit, I follow a few, not very many, but a few sort of business type accounts on social media. And there seems to be a difference in how companies go about constructing systems, depending on whether their mission is to make money or if their mission is to make the best dinner plates in the world. And like, there are like a substantial number of companies sort of in both camps. And it seems to me like how you would go about evaluating a system would have to begin with, well, what's the mission, right?
Again, it depends who owns the company. It would be the first question I'm going to ask.
Okay.
As an in-house auditor, I represent the board of directors. A conversation I was having today where somebody's saying, well, but this would be in the best interest of company, and me going, well, yes, but it's not in the best interest of the investor. So no, we're not doing that.
Gotcha. Okay.
So like when you talk about, you're basically talking about the difference between a company in which you have moneyed interest, Wall Street banks involved, right? We solely focused on making money, versus somebody that's actually still running their own company. I want to make the best dinner plate possible. And I forget the CEO's name, but he was the CEO who really led Southwest Airlines to prominence. And he had this mission of, we want to be the low-cost carrier for airline travel. And so everything in his mind, everything that any decision making, that was the North Star he put out there, and they were going to be the low-cost carrier. So if I'm coming in from an operational audit standpoint, and they're like, we need to figure out how baggage, like for example, makes us the low-cost carrier, that's going to be my North Star. But in the back of my head, I have to remember Southwest is a publicly traded company, which means that they still have to make money. He can say whatever he wants. At the end of the day, the board of directors wants him to increase shareholder value. Right. So if I have to play the game now of knowing which levers and to push with whom, because if I'm trying to get buy-in from the people who are throwing the bags, I'm going to talk about safety. I'm going to talk about job security. I'm going to talk about pride. I'm going to talk about unsung heroes.
So then the superstructure of laws surrounding publicly traded companies dictates the framework within which we can evaluate other systems beneath it.
You could say that. There's the law. There's the law that we think that exists, and then there's what actually happens.
Right. Well, and I mean, this sounds very abstract and maybe like business student nerdishness until we go back to one of your other backgrounds in education, where like, we've got all this data on test scores now. And on the one hand, test scores can be potentially maybe a very useful way of gauging the value of education. But one could also ask, perhaps, what is the relationship between a test score and a good education? Like, what is the goal of education? Is it to make money, which is like maybe metaphorically, getting high test scores, or is it to make the best dinner plate possible, which is to turn out like competent, this goes back to philosophy questions about like, what is a good life? What do we want our students to be like? Our children to what kind of adults do we want our children to turn into? And I mean, maybe you could zoom that in and say, well, okay, what's the role of the state or these, schools in facilitating that? Maybe we have a narrower domain in pursuing that, and some things are not the school's job. But still, given that students are there for 6.5 or 7 hours a day, 5 days a week for most of their lives, like, how do we? Do you know much about the background of how standardized testing came about, or the systems minded? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So what you're talking about is there's a tension in education, right? There's a fundamental question that will divide most everyone in the educational field into two camps, right? Are we educating a workforce, or are we creating citizens?
Mm-hmm.
There's always the principal who got promoted into her level of incompetence who goes, let's do both. Well, you can't, because the standardized testing regime is really good at making drones, but it's very poor at making citizens. And I think we're seeing the effects of that now.
Mm-hmm.
The testing is only going to be as good as the guy who designed it for what they designed it for. So like when you go back in time, like you actually like where was our first standardized test? They were actually used as immigration controls. So the foundations of the SAT were actually an entrance exam to the United States used during the period of high immigration with the idea of weeding out the undesirables. And it became a really good tool to just to say like, oh, there isn't racism here. This is a completely blind thing. But the fact that the test is only available in English already excludes a lot of people, and it would exclude a lot of tradesmen who can't read. Right? It was just a control tool. But of course, once you win one government contract, your sole focus is winning the next government contract. So now it became, oh, we can do this for intelligence. And so the SAT then, of course, got a competitor with the ACT, and the testing industry then started to come into all these different places. How do we know that a doctor is qualified to be a doctor? How do we know a CPA is ready to practice before the SEC? How do we know that a psychologist isn't just like helping people bypass and creating cults? And the answer was, well, now we have this thing that removes the human persuasion, removes the ability to fool it. It's dispassionate. It's not racist or any of the other things that boogeymans that people put out.
So it's like scientific because it's removing a degree of human subjectivity,
correct,
or at least seems to be removing a degree of human subjectivity from the equation.
Correct. But the biggest thing to understand about standardized tests is they're not inherently bad, but they are inherently biased. The fact that they're written down means they're already biased towards the literate.
Right.
So
yeah.
So
it's a classic story in the trades of like that one crotchety old guy who can't like communicate worth a damn, can't like explain himself, is horrible to send apprentices to, but man, can he figure out problems. He can do basically anything on the job site. And I imagine there are some Rain Man genius types like that in the business world who maybe not the best communicators, but man, can they solve problems. And how do you map that on a generalized like intelligence test? How do you quantify the value of a person like that?
Or even what makes up intelligence, right? Like, there's the obvious, there's like the age old thing of like, if we judged everyone's ability to by climbing a tree, the goldfishes all look retarded. Like,
right.
The test itself can be useful, but the test is only going to measure your ability to take that test. So like in your example with the crotchety guy, if you gave him a test on his area of expertise, he's probably going to score very high. But if you gave him a test on like, ways to gently talk to somebody, maybe not so much.
Or even if you gave him a test asking him to explain his own area of expertise, he might not be able to say all the right things nearly as well as he can do them. whereas someone who's been trained in how to say all the right things can perhaps do that very well. It's one of the reasons I enjoy in out of the domain of business and education stuff and into the domain of moral philosophy. I love that scene from American Psycho where Patrick Bateman is chastising his friends. Come on, Bryce, there are more important things than Sri Lanka to worry about. We have to feed the homeless, and he's got this shit-eating grin smirk as he's just runs the gamut of all the good things that they have to do. He's like, he knows how to say all the right words, but you would never like, I think anyone who has seen that scene or seen people, splurt out the platitudes that they were told to say and never done anything meaningful about, would know better than to judge someone's moral competence based on saying the right things.
Right.
And the same is true in perhaps other domains as well.
Well, but that was the entire impetus behind No Child Left Behind. It's the same type of idea, right? George W. Bush was going to fix the school systems, and he was going to do it by going after teachers. And the way that he decided to do it was with the standardized test, because we're going to weed out the bad teachers, right? And so they make that, and of course, a lot of the teachers and teachers unions were front and center on this, going, no, like, these tests don't test anything. This doesn't help us with the, raise students, and we're dealing with society problems, and students are constantly tracking their personal lives in here. And the retort back to that was, the number one in-school determinator of a student's success is teacher quality. And like, okay, that's an interesting thing to measure. You're going to need a lot of statistical power to get that one done. But there was a critical word in there: in school. The number one in school,
right,
factor. But the question is, in the total amount of that student's life, what is the biggest impact? And it turns out that the actual in-school factors are like 10% of their entire makeup. The other 90% are what's going to count. So now you have a test that's trying to assess this teacher based upon the idea that they have the largest part of the pie when they have the largest part of 10% of the pie.
Right.
And so your system is set up inherently to produce a different result than the one that was stated.
Yeah. And that can create all kinds of perverse incentives. I could imagine, teachers trying to move to other parts so that they can get, of the country, so that they can get better scores with better, more, shall we say, student bases with maybe a bigger home life leg up on their testing.
So the results are actually known.
Okay.
And this will be infuriating. When I worked in education still, I used to get in fights with people about this all the time. Because I'm nothing if not principled. And so there's a couple different ways to think about it. The first one you hit right on your head. If you're a teacher, under game theory, you now are incentivized to figure out where those other 90% variables are more in your favor so you can look good, which is why you saw a lot of teachers move into more wealthy districts. But the teachers left over, or the ones that didn't want to move, or the ones who are moral crusaders or whatever, the ones that were left basically had a couple of different options. One of them was to just cheat, which we saw in Georgia. That actually happened. That happened in Chicago.
I think more than just those two places too.
But those were the two high-profile cases that ended up in the news.
Gotcha. Yeah.
But the more common path was to disqualify students. So one of the quirks in the United States is that we test 100% of our student population. So whenever you see comparisons of we're behind Japan, my question is, what part of Japan? Because they only test a certain segment of the top segment of their students, and we test all of them. So the nonverbal autistic kid in the corner is being thrown in against Japan's top 25%.
Right.
So how do we get them out of the population so that our test scores look good? The answer is you classify them all as special needs. And this did a couple of things. When you started looking, when you classify a kid as special needs, they get what's called an individual education plan, or an IEP, or they can go in section 504 of public law. But the end result's the same. You can now change the rules on how they take tests and whether or not they even have to take them. And so you find ways to start disqualifying students. And it comes with the added bonus. that if you overlay a map, and this is the one that where I like started losing my mind, but if you overlay a map of where they were making school cuts with the rise of autism in school districts, it matches.
Oh
and the
my
reason
God.
is that there's federal dollars attached to getting kids diagnosed with autism. Now, think about how the system is. We lowered the fundings to be punitive to the teachers. We saddled them with these testing requirements that don't actually test anything. And they just found a way to work with the system to replace the funding so they didn't lose their job. And people will say, well, those teachers are evil. No, they're self-interested, just like everyone else. Like, if you get a weird result out of the system you have created, blaming the people for doing what you incentivize them to do is the wrong answer. You have to go back and ask, how did I make that result?
Yeah.
And that's what's happened. So when I was a teacher, I had students who would come through and they'd be like, I'm not doing anything. Why? Because I have an IEP. My IEP says that I can't fail your class. Adorable, but I can make your life a living hell until you do what I want. So I found a way around it. But that's what's happened. That's what the system has produced.
This reminds me of, I mean, this hasn't been implemented yet in the United States, but there's all this political debate about UBI, Universal Basic Income. And there are arguments that I'm not very well versed in for it, and arguments I'm slightly more well versed in, but probably are kind of amateurish against it. But the biggest argument I heard against Universal Basic Income was that he said, well, someone on Twitter, I think, said, well, that will just incentivize cities to start killing off the freeloaders. And the more you think about it, the more you're like, oh my God, it will. You know, like maybe.
Well, we already do that though.
With
like
fentanyl,
that's not
yes,
any different. We just do that now with extra steps. You know, like
totally. Yeah.
I live in Denver, and I don't recall exactly where you live, but if I go downtown, I can see what's occurring, right? We have a growing homeless population here, and the cops continually push them into areas that are more and more hostile to them, and the deaths are rising, right? We're heading into winter. So like we already as a society have mechanisms by which we're doing that. We just don't call it that.
So this is one of the most fascinating things to me about all of these conversations about statistics and systems is that it feels like there's kind of a social Heisenberg effect, where as soon as you start to, Scott Adams said, you always manage to what's measured from a business management perspective. It's like, as soon as we start laying out standards, whether that's standardized tests in school or GDP for a nation, we can maybe get to Thomas Carlyle and his opinion on that in economics at some point. But like, as soon as you lay out a standard, a quantitative standard to try to measure things in a simple way, that seems to change a lot more variables than was initially intended, perhaps. Because all these standards seem to be established on the assumption that nothing else will change in response to the standard itself. Whereas in fact, like, people understand the standards that they are being measured against. This was, everyone loves to bash on him, but to his credit, I think this was something George Soros, of all people, pointed out in his like study of like reflexivity. He says, no economic model will work forever, because economic models are modeling human behavior, and humans are aware of the models. You know, basically, I'm oversimplifying, but
well, it's a societal level of what's called the Hawthorne effect. The Hawthorne effect, of course, being if somebody knows. So the Hawthorne studies are a famous case study for MBA students, in which they were trying to determine to what level the lights had to be on to maximize production, right? And so they had a test group in their own room, and they were turning up the lights, and productivity was increasing, right? And they're like, oh, so brighter lights means they can see better, so they can clearly do better. So then they decided to see how low they could get them, and productivity also increased. And they were like, what's going on here? And it turns out that the people were in there, they just didn't want to disappoint their boss, so they were going to work harder because they knew they were being seen.
Interesting.
So like there's some panopticon ideas about workplaces here that are uncomfortable, but Mr. Soros is 100% correct, and so is Mr. Adams. When you look at it, any model, if you're managing to the metric, you're going to manage that metric.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no way around that. That's a limitation of metrics, but metrics are still informative. So the
Right.
goal then has to be, how do we create a metric that gets closer and that we can continue to tinker with, that gets us closer and closer to being able to manage the thing we're looking for? And
Right.
like I've said this on my podcast, Intuitive Finance, a whole lot. GDP is a terrible metric to measure an economy. It's
Right.
absolutely horrible. And yet we continue to use it because it's simple.
Right. And it feels to me like it's easy to get caught in a kind of rhetorical trap, because the goal of, to go back to education for a second, to me it seems not just stupid, but almost malicious, or at the very least negligent, to act as if the goal of education is singular. Like, the goal of education is to lead a child out of childhood and into adulthood. Exducare, it's literally the out of childhood. And the difference between an adult and a child isn't just one thing. It's not their ability to do arithmetic alone, nor is it their ability to write alone, or their ability to interact socially in a competent manner alone. It's a lot of different things. And it seems to me that any kind of systematization in terms of outcomes can be tremendously beneficial at the individual level. One of my favorite, I'm sort of a gun guy, Instagram content guys, this guy named Lucas Botkin, who's all about numbers with shooting. It's about speed and accuracy, and he has his little systems that he uses for himself in improving his ability to shoot quickly and accurately. Tremendously beneficial use of systems. But at a higher level, that's just one thing, and if you were to say be a soldier or a hunter, or even, like, I don't know, some, can't think of much else that involves shooting besides those two, but there's a lot more to fulfilling those roles than just that one skill. You need to be able to navigate in the land. You need to be able to track an animal's trail, or do medical stuff, or all kinds of other things. Just like becoming an adult requires social abilities and mathematical abilities. Not being autistic might be useful, or at least diagnosed with it. And it feels like there's a risk with almost any of these systems of a kind of tunnel vision or solipsism, in the cases where goals might be multifaceted and intertwined. Like, maybe we're a company that's trying to make the best plate and make money, or maybe turn out adults who are both good citizens and good workers, as the case may be.
Right, but again, then you're competing. Like, okay,
is the challenge that we can't create a standardized system for gauging both of those two things, or is the idea we literally cannot create people who are both good citizens and good workers?
So that depends, and like, what makes a good citizen, what makes a good worker. I would argue that a citizen is somebody who's actually going to focus on society. So let me give you an example. If you're owning a factory and you're like, I want to buy my next yacht, so I'm going to lay off 10% of this factory, and it's going to devastate this town. Right? A very common. I grew up in the Rust Belt. Very common thing. Right? My hometown literally has a hole in it where the factory used to be. Like, you drive through and it's like they bulldozed the entire thing. And if you looked at a satellite image, there's literally a hole in the city. Wow. And so, like, and I had uncles and cousins and stuff who worked in supporting industries, but the car people wanted to make extra money. Well, okay. So from a good worker standpoint, what's a good worker? Well, I'll retrain. I'll go find a new way to be economically useful. They're going to go into this. A good citizen might say, you just devastated my town, and now you want more tax breaks. Fuck you. Right? A good citizen might be like organizing him and 20 of his best friends to go take over that guy's house. Like, That's the danger when you start talking about good citizens, that like,
Right.
yes, this involves Cicero giving speeches in the Senate, and it involves, mounting the barricades in the French Revolution. So like, if you're now looking at it and saying, your viewpoint on that is going to affect how you fund it.
Mhm.
Right. And so like, when you're looking at the good worker, what you deem as good worker is going to affect how you want to fund it, what type of metrics you're in, what type of teachers you're going to allow. This is shop class is the great example. People bitch about this all the time. And I say, hey, I'm 100% there. I grew up in the trades, right? My whole family, like the construction company my family founded 120 years ago is still in operation.
That's super cool.
Yeah, it just turns out that I'm the first son of the second son of my grandfather, so we didn't get the construction company. But my cousin still runs it, right? And his son will probably take it over when he retires. But you look at, so I'm all for shop class, but are you willing to double the educational budget to bring those types of things in?
Yeah.
Are you willing to see your tax base, your taxes go up, and a societal level to support having more well-rounded individuals who can start businesses? And does our current system, and this is where you get into really systems thinking, does our current economic system and the infrastructure, the literal physical infrastructure we've created, even support those people if we actually produce them? And I would argue that the answer is absolutely not. The part of the reason that the educational system doesn't produce those people is because they would have nowhere to go. Our current system does not incentivize those types of individuals to even exist.
Well, because you mentioned Cicero a minute ago, you're bringing up some questions that were asked in some of Cicero's writings. He has this wonderful book, De Orator, about what makes someone a good speaker, and it's brought up by a question of one of the characters in the dialogue: can a good speaker even be taught, or is it pure natural ability? And there's some disagreement between the characters as to whether that can be done. Can schools actually churn out entrepreneurs, or, as appears to be the case with many Ivy League schools, do certain educational brands just compete with the people who appear to be the geniuses who are most likely to become those people, and then take credit once they become what they were going to become anyways?
This is where being in Taiwan for a few years actually is extremely informative, right? Because to Cicero's point, there's always going to be those Mustangs, and you're not going to be able to compete with them, right? You're just not. For whatever reason, they're going to go. But can we develop a society in which has the infrastructure and the system set up such that lower level entrepreneurs, the guy who wants to open his own mechanic shop, the gal who wants to open a bakery, the dude who wants to be slinging smoothies, can they create a business that they can be proud of and become members of the community? Does our current infrastructure, the physical infrastructure of society, support that? And the answer, I think, is an emphatic no.
Okay. And do you think the emphatic no is because there are roads and proverbial roads that would be required that we just don't have? Or do you think it's more because there are regulations in place that prohibit that kind of thing, or something else?
The regulatory regime, I think, is the least of everyone's problems.
Okay.
So what I would say is that we actually have the roads, and this is where you get into like really looking at systems. So, in my audit world, it's all about infrastructure. Infrastructure is the thing that I know best. It's the one thing I'm all constantly looking at. So how does infrastructure impact a society? If you think about at least in America, in the United States and Canada, we've gone all in on personal transport. And when you do that, what you do is you have to create an entire infrastructure of both, government funding, government projects, government propaganda. There's policy decisions that decide that the car will be the default form of human transportation, not the actual default form of human transportation, which is walking.
Right.
Now, you look at small businesses. What's the number one indicator for small businesses to succeed? It's foot traffic. And so when you look at that and you say, we went all in on the car, we eliminated the ability for foot traffic to even exist. And so you would say, well, but what about malls? Well, malls are going away, right? That's what we did. We found a way to carize foot traffic with malls, but even that's gone away. And in society, we've gotten rid of third places. But when you look at other countries, like in Taiwan, you can't swing a dead cat by the tail without hitting 3 entrepreneurs and a pregnant woman. Like, they're all over the place.
So what you're saying then is that suburbs prohibit it.
Suburbs, highways, the fact that we don't have public transportation, all of those things. So when you look at
public
that,
transportation, sometimes, I rode public transportation for a while. Like the amount of public transportation that would be required to make that kind of like infrastructure you're describing of transportation possible. Expanding public transportation sounds like it would be a band-aid on a bullet wound. It seems more like zoning laws and the suburbs, because how would you open any kind of shop in a suburban environment?
That's exactly the point. You can't. And that's why when we say because when you have the educational system of Taiwan, there's an option for you to go to trade school when you're 12.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people do. And in trade school, they teach you how to start a business, manage your books, do all the things. And so these people are walking out with the expectation that they're going to go buy a scooter shop, they're going to open a tea shop, and these tea shops are viable businesses because there's so much foot traffic. We don't have that. So this is an example of how the system that we've created for, to benefit car companies and concrete companies and all this other stuff, we actually used to have this. So if you look at pictures of like people in the downtowns, like what did downtown Milwaukee, what did downtown Denver look in 1945? Well, they all had light rail, they all had streetcars, they all had walkable neighborhoods. And we as a society literally decided to create a car-centric system. So we paid those cities to rip that all out.
Now, do you know the background? I don't. So this is a genuine question. Do you know the background on what was the thinking behind the decision to go all in on cars? Like,
how deep down the conspiracy theory hole do you want to go?
Well, I'm imagining one of two scenarios. And I don't know which one is true, or maybe a third option. But my guess is it's either a bunch of urban planners were brought together from around the country and perhaps around the world to Washington, D.C. to make grand economic plans to say, hey, we'll have better economic outcomes if we design cities in this way. Or that's option one. A bunch of city planners said, we're going to consciously do these things for economic gain. So they have a systems approach from a probably called GNP back in the day, to try to improve economic productivity of the nation by specializing, so to speak, in economic zones. Or option two, the conspiracy option, a bunch of car manufacturers, Ford and so forth, said, hey, let's market the shit out of this and maybe buy a few politicians to do this thing. Now but if option two appears to be the more historical account, my question would be, how would they have persuaded the public to do that? Would they not have made arguments that look a lot like option one?
So the actual answer from Dylan Bain's perspective, from where I sit, is option two there's option three, and okay. Option three is option two on steroids. And so when you look at this, and like, here's the deal. I love my car. I love driving. I really do, but I have to operate in reality. So when you start looking at how these things fit together, you start seeing, like, what's been seen can't be unseen. It's really difficult for me to not look at this and go, if I'm on board with human flourishing, I have to be real sober about what I'm looking at and how I'm analyzing it.
We'll get to defining human flourishing in a few minutes.
Yeah. So, not the suburbs. But
right. That's universally agreed upon.
Yeah. So, like, if we look at this, if you actually look at the historical, like, what's not debated, conservative, libertarian, liberal, whatever, let's just look at what they all agree on. What they all agree on is that after World War II, Eisenhower wanted to have an Autobahn. situation, and we needed places to land B-52s. So they fused those two together and they created the highway system. At the same time, we thought we were going right into the next war. And so we didn't want to deindustrialize our capacity to be able to produce engines for cars, well, for Jeeps and tanks. So there was suddenly this weird fusion. So
they kept the automotive industry going on federal dollars to keep tank production at the ready.
Correct. But it's worse than that. It's going to get worse than that. So just buckle in and stay with me for a second. Because remember, Eisenhower's farewell address is famous for the words "in military industrial complex." He started this and it got away from him, and he realized what he did at the end of his presidency.
Interesting.
So now now you go to your option one, like, there's economics. So the car companies are saying, like, literally the head of General Motors became the Secretary of Transportation, was asked during his confirmation hearing, could you make a decision that would be bad for General Motors if it was good for the country? And his response was, I don't believe such a situation would ever exist.
Which is to say no.
Yeah. But his whole thing is like, whatever's good for General Motors is inherently prima facie good for America.
Axiomatically, yes.
Yeah, which is not true. But
right.
The point being is that then they said, you hit it right on the head. Well, people already had their established ways. It was possible in 1945 to go from Portland, Maine to Milwaukee, Wisconsin using nothing but municipal light rail. That's how ubiquitous it was. We had passenger rail, that's how people got around. And the cities like downtown Milwaukee, downtown Denver, Cleveland, Cincinnati were walkable communities with these light rail systems going through them. So the car companies needed two things. Number one, they needed to get rid of the alternatives to driving, right? Because people just like their light rail. And the way they did that was they just literally bought up the light rail and dismantled it.
But here's the white pill. Here's the white pill. This is the best of both worlds is coming, where we're going to have driverless cars that are controlled by AI. So that way, after we tore up all the railroads and made everything dependent on cars, we can now ride in cars as if they were trains with all the infrastructure of cars without the pleasure of driving them. It'll be awesome.
That's the white pill. That's the white pill. So long as you don't scratch the paint off of it, that really reveals the black pill underneath. Because
I couldn't resist the joke. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I understand. But this is a great example of how the system, like we as Americans didn't choose cars; they were foisted upon us, and we created this system. But what came with that system too? Well, the federal highway system. And when you had that, now suddenly you have communities that are separated. Like I live right by a 6-lane road. It's actually properly called a strode. But to cross it is dangerous. So if somebody lives on the other side of that, and there are shops on the other side of it, they're as far away from me as something 20 miles away from a walking standpoint. I'm never going to go there. So now you have a system that's keeping us separate. Oh, and by the way, we pulled out the streetcars, we pulled out the foot traffic, we started to reduce this. What happens economically? Well, economically now you need to have minimum parking because everybody hates having to look for parking. So now you have minimum parking laws and zoning laws that you already hit on that are now supporting this car-centric infrastructure that's creating a system that is now incentivizing the only players who can play in the game are those who can afford to build the parking lot, i.e. large companies or those funded by Wall Street. So now we've created a system, the actual physical infrastructure is incentivizing the rise of the big box store. And this is where we start to get into it. But that's not we haven't got to the bad part. Here's the bad part. The system we decided on was great from a political standpoint because we can put this in and everyone's going to love it and they'll vote for me and I didn't raise your taxes. But what's the biggest problem with road? Like what is the thing people hate most about roads? Road construction. And how often does a road need to be replaced? About every 20 years. So the more roads,
unless you live anywhere where it freezes regularly, then it's about every 3 or 4 years.
So I grew up in Wisconsin. So I know all about that. It turns out that only knocks about a couple of years off of it. It's actually weight and traffic are the two biggest determinators in how fast it goes down.
I'm exaggerating slightly, but yeah,
But yes,
I believe it.
well, I mean, that's what they used to say in the winter times, that it's great because all the potholes freeze over and the roads are smooth again. But the point being is that we suddenly find ourselves, why is it that so many municipalities now are running out of money for schools? Why are they going bankrupt? Why do they have huge debt loads? Because they have this big infrastructure debt. We chose the least efficient, most expensive way to build infrastructure that also incentivizes a downward trajectory of economic opportunity for the average person. And that's how the system is it's functioning. The suburbs are really great from an economic standpoint because now everybody needs a blender, everyone needs a microwave, you have the needs to purchase stuff to make that work is huge, right? Whereas if you live in an apartment with a bunch of dudes, you need one blender for 4 dudes.
Right. So
right?
It increases demand, which increases production, which increases that movement that we call, GDP.
Correct. So the GDP is going up because everyone's buying their blenders for their individual house at the same time that business opportunities and economic mobility is going down.
Right. And people are also having to work more hours, presumably, in perhaps conditions that they would otherwise not enjoy as much, in order to afford all these things that are essentially required by how things have come to be within this system.
Correct. And so once you like, the commute is the most dehumanizing thing in the world. Like I'm lucky I work from home. But when I was commuting, it's 25 minutes into Denver, 25 minutes back. That's an hour of my life I'm not getting back.
Tell me about it. I've been commuting an hour to an hour and 15 minutes a day, each direction, every day for my work for the past year now. So I've listened to a lot of podcasts, a whole lot of audiobooks.
100%. But now stop and go back to the educational question. Now that we have the road infrastructure systems thing out here, right? What are we building for? Citizens? Well, we killed our communities. We don't actually gather. We have no third places. So what are the citizens of? And we want good workers, but we don't even know what that's going to look like. So now this becomes and because of our infrastructure debt, our available funding for education is decreasing. And then why isn't the people organized? Well, because they're all spread out. It's the whole phrase, I wanted to join the revolution, but I couldn't find parking. Right? So like for me, if I was going to if I spent 15 minutes knocking on doors, I'll get to 10. That's not a mob. Whereas if I'm in Paris, I put my head out in the window and say, hey, Pierre, we're revolting again. And they say, okay. And now I got 20 guys. Right.
Right. Yeah. Well, so to me, it feels like there are maybe 3 great values in studying systems. There is the employment of systems in our own lives, right? Like, and here I think we were talking before we started recording about our your wife, but my wife fits in this category too. She is very much a systems thinker, and our house has come to reflect that over the years. As you implement these systems in your house that make life easier, it's like we do things this way. For example, we took out the dishwasher. We don't have a dishwasher in our house because it's actually a better system for us, which is kind of counterintuitive. But and so there's personal improvement. Then there's like maybe I guess you would call it forensic systems thinking, sort of working backwards of how did we get to the place we are now, sort of what you've walked us through over the last 40 minutes or so. Because it's hard for me to imagine anyone without serious time in the systems design world understanding everything that you just laid out, at least not without having it explained to them.
100%. Well, there's basically 5 principles, right? And the 5 principles you have to look at are interconnectedness, to understand that all these pieces fit together somehow. And that when you tickle over here, it's like a dog, like you scratch behind his ear and his leg starts going, right? There's a connection there.
Right.
and predictably we can that interconnectedness means that I have to be really careful when I do one thing here because of how it might affect over here.
Mm-hmm.
There's synthesis, which is the idea that like two systems can interplay and end up with a third system, right? And you see this a lot with vertically integrated investor-owned power utilities, where you have one person with it's basically a regulated monopoly.
Right.
They have a synthesis of stakeholders: regulators, ratepayers, and investors. Those three people are not going to get along, and so the synthesis of those three systems creates the power utility. Emergence, which is systems will develop when like actors, when left to their own devices, will inherently create systems
like an ecosystem in nature.
Correct. Yeah. So ecosystems are a great example of this. But like, if you've ever been in like a retreat with dudes and you're like, we need to set up this room for dinner, like you won't have to say another thing. They're all just like figure out a role and start doing it.
Yeah.
That's an idea of an emergent system. Or it's when like you have a big mob and you tell everybody like, all right, move. Inherently, people will start on one side, we walking all in the one direction, and the other side they'll walk in the other. Or like if you are looking at where do we put sidewalks at a college campus, the best thing to do is wait for it to snow, and don't pave anything. Wait for it to snow, and then see where the tracks in the snow, and put the sidewalks there.
Right.
That's clever. Number 4 is feedback loops, that different systems will reverberate off of each other, right? If I'm incentivized, so like in construction is a great example of this. You said safety sacrosanct. Well, maybe that's what we have to say, but the feedback loop might be, but if I limit safety, then I get my bonus because I'm faster, so I lower safety, so I move faster, so I lower safety, and I move faster, right? There's a feedback loop that's in that. So when you're changing systems, the interconnectedness can create a feedback loop, and understanding that those feedback loops can be self-sustaining. Suburbs are an example of this. The car infrastructure we're talking about is an example of this. And then lastly is causality and system mapping. Things in systems happen for reasons. There is nothing that just is random. Okay. Now, yes, there's random things that occur, like things break down, weather patterns, whatever. But even those are causal, right? So let's say in a transportation system, you have a snowstorm that snarls up the transportation system. Well, that was a failure on our part to plan for it. The snarl was caused by the predictable event of the snowstorm.
Right.
Winter Storm Uri in Texas, 2001, I think it was. It's when Texas got a cold snap. Natural gas prices went from $6 per MBTU to $600 per MBTU in 15 minutes. And Texas's power grid shut down. Well, why did that happen? Because they didn't winterize their system, and they should have, and they know this, and this happens every 5 years. So when you start looking at it,
something like that just happened like 2 or 3 years ago.
Oh yeah, that's Winter Storm Uri.
Yeah.
The reason I know that is because on Monday morning I got a phone call from our CFO from the power utility I was working for, going, "I just spent $1 billion over the weekend. I need you to tell me." I need you to tell me if I committed fraud. But that's what he needed to do to keep the system on, right? Like,
right.
So there's that feedback loop. We have a cold snap in Texas. It freezes a couple of pipelines. Everyone turns on their peaking units. Natural gas prices spike. My company spends $1 billion. That's a feedback loop, right? And you can map in the system how one thing over in Texas, which is not connected to our power grid, can affect Colorado or Minneapolis or Wisconsin all the way up to Manitoba.
Right. Like a very, I guess, elementary, simple example of this was, there was all this debate surrounding Joe Biden using the strategic oil reserves. Mm-hmm. And people were saying, oh, this isn't going to affect our oil prices. Or maybe it was something else. Maybe it was shutting down some other pipeline elsewhere. And says, oh, none of this oil was coming to the United States economy anyways. It was being shipped abroad, but it still affects our oil prices because there's a global market for oil. And if the price of oil is, increased somewhere else, it's going to, affect demand globally because, everyone is trading in oil in a more or less fungible manner.
Right. Well, and OPEC manipulating oil prices is a great example of this, right? Like they understand the causality between number of rocker pumps operating and oil prices.
Right. And so that sort of dovetails into the third maybe value of systems thinking and learning to think in systems. And I've tried to explain, to articulate a few of the concerns I have with statistics thinking, but there are some limitations, but the values are tremendous. And the third benefit might be how might individuals be able to change things, not even in their own individual life, but maybe more broadly outside of just their own household. And one of the funnier examples of this, I don't know how far this went, but I'll bring up Scott Adams again. During COVID lockdown era, back when mask enforcement was still a thing, Scott Adams had taken to encouraging people to comply with the mask mandates in stores and the requirements, but to enter the store without a mask. And he says, and as soon as an employee says, sir, ma'am, we need you to wear a mask in here, say, oh yes, I'm sorry, and then you put it on. But and so it's kind of non-resistance, but the friction that would create if just 20% of the customers came in without wearing masks, and all the employees had to persistently every 5 minutes, and not even every 5 minutes, every 2 minutes, tell another customer, sir, we need you to put a mask on. Ma'am, we need you to put a mask on. Sir, we need you to put a mask on. Sir, like eventually the friction would cause them to just give up without any conflict, without any combativeness. Just that subtle kind of tweak is like that seems to be a kind of calling card for people who have some training in systems thinking. Whereas I think most Americans would be like, I'm going to bring my gun to the store, or, something a little more combative that just gets you in trouble and doesn't do anything. And do you have any thoughts on that kind of thinking or approach or advice, or like, is that silly? Does it take a degree of organization that is not feasible to most people?
No, he's 100% right. I mean, so that goes back to that interconnectedness thing, right? Understanding the emergence of how systems operate, what the feedback loops are, where the interconnectedness is, what's the synthesis. I mean, you can read the book Atomic Habits, and they talk about this exact thing. The more friction you put between an action, the less of it you're going to get. So what he's talking about is creating this friction thing, where you can see this is, we've already talked about this exact thing. Could I open up a donut stand on the corner of two major cross streets in my town and make it work with enough energy, time, and perseverance? Yes, I could. But I'm overcoming such a huge amount of friction that without superpower, it's not going to happen. And so when you look at like how politicians talk, where they're like, yeah, the voter ID is a great example of this. For the record, I have no issue with voter ID. I have issue with voter disenfranchisement. So if we want to do voter ID, it's the "Are you serious?" check. Great. Let's make sure that everyone who is an eligible citizen to vote can get one as easily as possible. Cool. Right. The fact that that job isn't in there, like in my home state of Wisconsin, where the voter ID law was paired with a reduction in funding for places that would issue IDs in very specific places, was just creating, and this is Republicans doing to Democrats, but Democrats are not innocent.
Oh, right? No. Well, I mean, that's the whole, this isn't even Republican or Democrat. This is just
looking for an honest politician is like looking for a virgin in a whorehouse.
Right. This is executive branch shenanigans, but the ATF, for example, is like with their wait times, and to a degree, just the tax stamps are not as prohibitive as they were like 30 years ago. $200 has gone down in value since the 1930s or 40s or whenever that was passed. But
but we just had the Supreme Court rule on this.
Yes.
With concealed carry. It's the same thing. So Adams is right. And when you start to understand how these systems work, you can start seeing what we're incentivizing and what we're not.
Mm-hmm. So then a systems approach would be thinking of ways to perhaps increase friction, maybe not oppose outright, but just increase friction a little bit, or as the case may be, reduce friction. For myself, I stopped going to a gym 3 years ago. COVID just made it annoying. So I got some rocks and I got some dumbbells, some weights, some running shoes, and I don't have to go anywhere to work out. I can just be in my house. And the little bit of a commute, that 10 to 15 minutes, or for me it'd be more like 20 minutes because all the gyms are really far away from me because I live in a suburb, are like that little bit of friction cut out makes taking the time to exercise really easy. And just removing that little bit of friction I work out every day. I don't work out a lot. Some days I might work out for 3 minutes, literally, just like, I'll do a few bicep
100%.
or whatever.
But stop and think about, like, think one step further than that, though, right? We've created systems in which we like to try to have as much profit bleed across our society as possible.
Mm-hmm.
So when we have cars increase, the default mode of human transportation goes down, which is walking. Obesity goes up. And then what do we sell them? We sell them a gym membership. And we don't stop and go, wait, hold on a second.
Why can't we be Europe?
Like why are the Europeans not getting fat? Oh, they walk everywhere? Okay, cool. Why do they not have higher rates of colon rectal cancer? Oh, because they don't have an adulterated food system? Oh, okay. Like the system's thinking on this is when you look at it and you see a bunch of poor people or homeless people or obese people, if your thought goes through your head of like, wow, they're just bad people, without going, wait, hold on, that's not the default state for humans. Right. Humans default are pretty fit animals, but they also default get about 15 to 20,000 steps a day. And so, if you go to the Netherlands, like, it's rains and it's shitty there, and they're all on bicycles.
And maybe that's the ultimate takeaway of this conversation too. At the end, talking about homeless people and addicts, because at the end of the day, we are systems, like our bodies are systems, and all the principles you laid out about feedback loops and syntheses and emergence and all of these principles seem to apply in our bodies and in our minds as well. And like the idea that this the spike in drug related overdoses and addiction that we've seen in the last 10 years is like the result of a decline, a general must be genetic or perhaps religious decline in moral character. Seems almost preposterous, not least because in my conversations with the homeless, I haven't detected an absence of religiosity in that crowd, just from observation. But the system's view seems to bring so much more, not just explanatory power, but so much more actionable understanding to these things.
Exactly. I mean, and you hit, I think that's a great takeaway. And I think you hit it right in your head. I mean, people say, well, the homeless, there's so much mental illness. Well, if you were homeless, you'd have some mental issues too.
Yeah. And if you went through public school and were made autistic for the benefit of teachers, then you've got mental illness by definition, and we can't help you.
Exactly. I mean, the list goes on. The biggest takeaway when it comes to systems, and this is very much of a what has been seen can't be unseen type of situation, is that human beings respond to incentives. So how we set up the environment is going to dictate human behavior. And those are going to be always more insidious, more harder to see, and more powerful than any type of individual choice or personal responsibility on a collective level.
Yeah. And even and I won't keep you too much longer because we've been going for about an hour now. But I love that humans respond to incentives. There's this a University of Washington economics professor who goes by the stand-up economist who did his 10 rules of economics, and one of them was humans respond to incentives. And but he was translating the 10 laws, and the translation of humans respond to incentives was it was pointing out it was actually a tautology. Because what is an incentive? Well, an incentive is something that induces a change in behavior. So people respond to things that induce responses. As I'm totally butchering it because it's probably late for both of us, but it is a good thing to remember. Even tautologies are good things to remember sometimes. Dylan, it's been freaking fantastic chatting. You have quite a bit of your own content, your own podcast, your own services that you provide. Where can people go to find you and hear the other stuff you have to say, and maybe get some value from you elsewhere?
100%. You can find me. So my podcast is Intuitive Finance with Dylan Bain. You can find it wherever you find your podcasts. Instagram is where I'm most active. That's at the Dylan Bain. And of course, I have dylanbain.com, where I offer financial coaching, workshops, retreats, and the whole gamut of ways to help accelerate your life.
Fantastic. I'll throw links to those in the description here. Awesome. Dylan, this has been extremely enlightening and super fun conversation. Thanks so much for coming on.
My absolute pleasure.